Hello, this time on Sitrep.
We're turning a page. We're opening a new chapter.
A new defence and security partnership to strengthen our cooperation and strengthen our security.
On the defence industry, but also military mobility, peace building, crisis management, or the countering of hybrid threats, just to name a few.
The new UK-EU defence partnership is hailed as turning a page after Brexit, but most of the new chapter doesn't seem to have been written yet. We explain what's in the deal, what isn't, at least yet, and what it could mean for our defence and armed forces. Also on Sitrep, amid intense scrutiny on UK special forces, is a new legal framework needed, both for public confidence and the sake of those troops. And a reshuffle of Britain's top brass is underway. We'll get Mike's take on the new First Sea Lord and who could be taking on the other top jobs.
Sitrep with Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
It's exactly a year since Rishi Sunak called the last general election. And in those 365 days, Mike, you and I have talked many times about how Keir Starmer wanted to reset relations with the EU and how a defence partnership would be the centrepiece and possibly his trump card. Well, now he's played his hand, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. And the defence partnership, in a sense, is the easiest bit of a reset with the EU for reasons that we can talk about, because it's an obvious thing that both sides want. The era that we're living through really means that the Europeans have got to stick together, the big European countries. And, you know, what this is all about, this idea of an EU reset, it's based on a calculation that the government is making. And their calculation, I think, in general terms, is that what people in the country worry about is standard of living, that is growth, and immigration. Those are the two things. They don't really care what our constitutional relationship is with the European Union. I mean, the parts of the press do, and the Conservative Party does, and they keep trying to raise the idea of a Brexit sellout and all that sort of thing. But the calculation of the government, if they've got this right, is that people only care about those two big issues, immigration and standard of living. And if a new deal with the EU can help with those two areas, make a difference in this Parliament, then they will have played their hand very well. Well, we'll find out. It'll take a couple of years, of course, but we'll find out if that calculation turns out to be a good one.
Well, let's get someone to help us dig through the detail of this defence partnership, though. Ed Arnold is with us once again. Ed is Senior Research Fellow for European Security at the defence think tank RUSI and a former infantry officer. Ed, good to see you again. So the formal document for this new security and defence partnership has 62 points of agreement. How many of them are actually about doing things, though?
I mean, very little. I think from the outset, the agreement does what it's supposed to. It resets the relationship, but it doesn't strengthen it. It effectively provides the mechanisms to do so. So it's really a commitment to talk more on a wide range of areas. So if you look geographically, it's pretty much talking about each region amounting to 60% of the globe. And then also if you take it thematically, like in terms of cyber, crisis management, extra, it's like 18 thematic areas. So it's very, very broad, but it's very, very light on the detail of what it would actually need to be achieved between the UK and the EU and cooperation in any of those areas.
And from the perspective, Ed, of the armed forces, potentially the most significant point is number 17. The UK will consider participation in EU civilian and military crisis management. The commitment is only consideration, but in what kind of things might that be looking to involve our armed forces?
Yeah, and this is the contentious part, and I think consideration would have been a key requirement of the UK government, so it's not effectively saying that they would join CSDP missions, which are Common Security and Defence Policy missions, the policy instrument of the EU. But actually, I mean, while it seems contentious, I think it is actually less than it appears for that reason. But also those types of missions, crisis management operations, politically, I think Europeans have, lost their political will to do those after failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and the Sahel, but also the capacity as we transition our armed forces back to defence and deterrence, principally against Russia, we're actually losing the capacity to do these style of missions. And equally, when these missions occur, the need to do one such as evacuation from Khartoum in 2023, they're generally done through coalitions of the willing or countries joining up with others to do those style of operations, not actually through CSDP. So I don't actually think it's very contentious from a UK side, and the UK can join CSDP missions alongside them through the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is what it was designed to do and is still committed to do.
Micah, it may seem less than it appears, but that point 17 also says the UK and EU will explore possibilities for further military cooperation. We've seen some commentary talking about the UK being dragged into an EU army. What's your take?
I always laugh when the concept of an EU army comes up.
Yeah.
I mean, the concept of an EU army, it doesn't get past first base. It doesn't even make first base. So whenever somebody talks about it, say, answer me some simple questions. How big will it be? Who will pay for it? What's equipment going to be? Who will command it? You can't answer any of those questions. The EU army is a complete myth. It goes back to the Treaty on the European Union, the old Lisbon Treaty. I mean, Article 42.2, right, is burned on my heart. Article 42.2, which is what used to be the Common Foreign and Security Policy. And all it said about the CFSP then was based on the idea that nations have sovereign powers to decide for themselves what they will contribute to the Common Foreign and Security Policy. And even then, the Treaty on the European Union, it had a big solidarity clause, Article 222, I always remember. And that was that states will act in solidarity with each other. And a lot of people said, oh, that means a Euro army. But look at Article 222. It says none of this shall impinge on the sovereign right of all of the members to choose their own defence and security policy. So the point is the EU, as we used to be part of it, didn't commit us to anything without our agreement. And this deal certainly wouldn't commit us to anything without our agreement. We might choose to be involved, but it's our choice because we remain, as we always have been, in security and defence affairs, a sovereign nation within the whole EU framework.
Ed, there's a lot in there about talking and information exchange. What channels does it open up?
I think the point is, I mean, it principally opens ministerial channels, so Foreign Secretary to the EU High Rep and also the Defence Minister to Defence Commissioner. So effectively starting off at the high level, and also the summits that will be every year will be political. So I think there's a lot ministerially there. But then the theory behind that is then it also trickles down into all of the other thematic areas. And like I said earlier, I mean, it's very broad. Which some people will see as good. There are lots to cooperate on. But I think given the geopolitical challenges that the UK and Europe faces, that it probably would have been better to actually just have maybe 3 points where they really need to cooperate. And it's very noticeable that defence industrial cooperation, which is probably where the most value between the UK and EU is absent. Again, it just says that we will, move forward in discussions. And I think this is sort of the political issue with the summit. I mean, there's so many deals, not just on defence and security, but other deals, youth mobility, that they just could not get over the line. So when they talk about close alignment, okay, but it also shows that there is still a deep rift between the UK and EU on a whole host of policy areas.
So, Mike, how beneficial is all of that to our defence?
Well, the thing that everyone's concentrating on is the idea of 150 billion fund for the SAFE fund, the Security Action for Europe fund. And we're going to have to pay to play to be in that. It makes no sense not to be in it for British industries, not to be part of it. It makes no sense for them to exclude people like BAE Systems and Babcock and so on. And it doesn't make any sense for us not to be in it. But we will have to pay to play, and that's not unreasonable for a country that's a third party. Interestingly, Ukraine is in the fund. I mean, Ukraine is part of the SAFE initiative, which is a progressive sort of move. But we'll see what that produces. I mean, it won't change the fact that we will still compete on, the big platforms, sixth generation platforms like the Tempest platform and all the robotics revolutions. But where it might make a difference, as Ed sort of implies, if we can then translate some of these things into a proper defence industrial strategy that is more in line with our European partners in the EU, then the idea of restocking, of sustainment, logistics, cooperation, building upwards in military systems rather than building downwards from 2040, building upwards from where we are in 2025 with improvisations and so on. Better for small, medium enterprises, potentially, for the wider sixth generation transformation of forces. There's a lot we might gain if we can do the deals, but we haven't even started to do them yet. And those deals, the specifics of those deals will be important. If we do them correctly, And if we get a good, as it were, arrangement with this 150 billion, then that potentially opens up a 10-year process of 800 billion euros, which the EU is proposing to raise and spend on rearmament of Europe. And it would be a tragedy if Britain were not involved in that in some intrinsically important way.
Well, let's drill down a bit more into the details of that fund now. And British access to the Security Action for Europe programme is talked about, but not yet confirmed. And details do seem pretty thin. Still, it had a cautious welcome from Kevin Craven, Chief Executive of the Defence Industry Association, ADS.
SAFE is an instrument of the European Union, part of a much wider programme of defence finance instruments that the EU is bringing in to be able to upgrade both the defence industry and the military capability across the continent. So it consists of about 150 billion euros of soft loans that can be issued to member states for developing military capability. Now, there is the ability for third countries, i.e. those countries not in the European Union, to participate if they have a defence and security pact. And the condition for their entry into it is both that security pact, but also a limit of some 35% of any individual project or capability agreement.
And so now the door is open for Britain to join this. What would its participation actually mean?
Well, we hope that we would get the same status as any of those other third countries, and that includes accession countries like Ukraine, for instance, whereby any given project like a new missile system or what have you, we would be able to share in up to 35% of that particular project. However, we are still light on the absolute details of how we might do that. It was not concluded in the pacts and the negotiations on Monday. So good news in that we have signed the pact with an intent to develop the details. Less good news in that we will still have to wait for the actual how that is going to work.
But it could mean orders for British defence businesses, could it?
I think that's almost certainly the case. Which is great news, and actually great news for Europe as well, because, I mean, if you look at the geography, the defence industry in the UK consists of around about 20% of physical capacity of the continent, and therefore would be welcome relief in terms of pace and capability to the Europeans.
So you say you don't know exactly how this is going to be achieved, the joining this fund, and the Prime Minister does say the door is open. What are the questions that you need answering?
So what are the specifics? So I've mentioned the existing arrangements where third countries could participate. If we are in that category, then it should be relatively straightforward and understandable. What we don't know whether there has been any particular negotiations around either the size of our participation or the agreements through which we might enter into that. So to give you an example of things that have been discussed but not agreed, some of the countries inside the EU Union wanted to limit our participation to 25%, and alternatively, we have also seen there might be at the top end of the expectations, a different category to the third countries, which would allow people like ourselves to participate perhaps even in a bigger way. So it's not clear. I'm managing expectations. I'm hoping we will get the same as everyone else.
One of the warnings we've heard many times is the need to build defence industry capacity for the long term. Is this a long-term thing that will help reshape defence industry?
It very much is a long-term thing. So this would cover the next period of the European Parliament of 7 years, and I think represents a very big step forward in formalising the desire of the UK to improve relationships with the EU more generally, but particularly allow channels for our military teams who have a great deal of respect for each other to work effectively.
So how soon do you actually expect to have the information you need?
We were hoping to see that on Monday. Whilst I'm not expecting it to be immediate, I wouldn't think it should take longer than 2 or 3 months.
Kevin Craven, it's great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Mike, just put this into context, will you? 150 billion is a huge number, but in the grand scheme of European defence spending, how much could or couldn't a British slice of it help us build up our defence manufacturing capacity?
Well, it won't be transformative in itself. But what's important, as Kevin Craven was saying there, is that if you're allowed to be up to 35% of a project, and it may be less than that, of course, it might be in some projects only 10% or whatever. But if you're working up to 35% of any project, then it means that you're in the architecture phase of it. You're in with the planning phase. You're in with the development phase. It means that your view and your contribution is part of the thing from the beginning. You can't plug into something if you're doing 35% of it when it's been going for several years. So you have to be in at the ground floor for all of these things. And that's a real bonus. And it will take time to build up. It will take time for that to become a benefit to British industry. But it does mean that it helps all of the European powers to rationalise their military spending, particularly certainly in this case on equipment, to rationalise it a bit more, because we all know that European military spending has been extraordinarily inefficient because it duplicates so many things that each nation has. So if we do more common planning, which this will help, then everybody will benefit. But it won't be immediate. It'll be something that will build up over 5 to 10 years, I would guess.
And Ed, this defence fund deal is still to be sealed. How important do you think it is for our defence?
Well, it'll be important again in the long term and incremental gains, and it will sort of get the UK in the foothold of EU financial instruments for defence and security going forward. So in that case, it is very important. But also when you look at potentially what for the EU, yes, they're making the funds available. As Mike said, the challenge has always been what to spend it on and when. And actually, when you look at other options for the UK, I mean, the UK is a founding member of Joint Armaments Cooperation. This is a programme with 6 other European nations and 7 further participant non-members. And programmes such as Boxer, the A400M Strategic Lift, they've all been developed through this mechanism, not through the European Defence Agency at 27. The week before this agreement was the first ministerial under the Trinity House Agreement between the UK and Germany, and they signed a statement of intent to develop long-range strike capabilities with a range of 2,000 kilometres. Really significant stuff. So actually, what are you looking at the UK and the EU and this fund? I mean, it's effectively ammunition production, which is very important. But again, it's not transformational. Where we want to work with others, we'll work with the US and we'll work bilaterally or unilaterally with Europeans to avoid having to do requirements gathering at 27 and slowing the whole process down.
So, Mike, looking at the big picture then, how do you assess this partnership? How different is it from the defence cooperation we had with the EU when we were part of it?
It's not really different at all. And that's the point. This represents continuity with what we had when we were a member of the EU, what we've had since we left the EU, and what we're now going to have with a closer relationship. The bit that we haven't made up on is not defence, but the wider security. If you think about policing, what we used to have in the policing business, dealing with serious organised crime and local criminals and so on, we used to have Europol and the Europol information system. We used to have the common arrest warrant. We used to have ECRIS, which is the European Criminal Records Information System. Very, very good system. Custody sergeant in Arbroath or Grimsby, could go on the ECRIS system and find out if a drunk that had been brought in from, seemed to be Estonian was also wanted for burglary in Estonia or not. And were you dealing with a drunk or were you dealing with somebody who had a string of convictions or allegations or arrest warrants following him around the European Union? We can't do that anymore. So we've lost a lot of the policing coordination and not been able to get all of it back. So in the broader security sphere, this doesn't address any of that. And that's still something that I care about and think about quite a lot. But on the defence side in general, this is all good continuity. It's not transformational for us, but it's good. It's better to have it than not.
So, Ed, a final thought from you then. To your mind, what is missing from this partnership and could come further down the line?
I think ultimately what's missing from this partnership is making the argument of why specifically it's UK-EU cooperation which is the difference in European security. So if you read the preamble, I mean, it's very much of a dark world getting darker, but then none of the rest of the document then answers that question. So if cables are cut in the Baltic Sea, that's not a UK EU issue. If little green men invade Gotland, that's not a UK EU issue. If there's missile strikes from Russia against RAF Lossiemouth in the north, that's not UK EU. It's very, very difficult to actually work out one of those vital areas of cooperation outside the general political warming of the relationship, which is critical, because a lot of this is actually NATO territory and also NATO EU territory. And the UK has other options through bilaterals, trilaterals and other forums such as the Joint Expeditionary Force. So that's the one thing I can't actually answer at the moment. What is it about UK EU cooperation in the military sphere which is so vital to European security? And I'm struggling to really identify anything.
To be continued. And if you're struggling, Ed, there's not much hope for us. Thank you very much for your time, Ed Arnold. Good to speak to you. Next, the work and reputation of Britain's special forces is under intense scrutiny at the moment. It's 2.5 years since a public inquiry began investigating allegations of unlawful killings in Afghanistan. Well, now, the BBC programme Panorama, which sparked the inquiry, has broadcast a second documentary with further claims. And earlier this year, a coroner ruled that the shooting of 4 armed members of the IRA by the SAS in 1992 was unjustified. The government is legally challenging that ruling and has pledged fullest support for SAS personnel. Well, now, given that there are official processes underway, those are much better placed than we are to properly discuss the facts and merits of each case. But we do want to reflect on the range of concerns they raise and whether the framework in which the SAS and SBS operate needs updating, both for the benefit of those who serve and also for public confidence. Mike, that there's a fundamental difficulty here that our special forces, by necessity, operate in total secrecy.
Yeah, and they have to do that, and they're very good at it, and they're world renowned in the way that they do it. And the government's policy is this, it was called NCND, neither confirm nor deny. So whenever the government is asked a question about the special forces, NCND, neither confirm nor deny. And the problem with that is that as the Special Forces operations have become more widespread and are used much more outside the framework of formal wars, then people get troubled by it, they get bothered by it. And we should be aware again that SAS and SBS are still quite small forces. I mean, the SAS is believed to be about a battalion-sized grouping, say 500 or 600 people. SBS is probably about half that size. Again, we don't know for sure. But we're dealing probably with fewer than 1,000 people in SAS SBS. So call it a one battalion and maybe a half a battalion in terms of size. But what they do is all over the world. I mean, they are called on to all sorts of things, and they are very, very well respected. But because they do so much, and because what they do is now more strategically important than it ever was before in these troubled times that we live in, it raises the problem that NCND, neither confirm nor deny, is not an adequate governmental policy to address issues that may be issues of culture and allegedly issues of the blatant disregard of both international law and UK domestic law. Allegations, but those allegations are very damaging, of course, to the whole ethos of the Special Forces, which in other respects is extremely highly regarded.
Well, earlier this month, a former commanding officer of 22 SAS in Northern Ireland, Brigadier Aldwyn White, issued a 3-page statement raising concerns that current inquiries demonstrate a naivety as to the reality of Special Forces operations. But he also warns of a dangerous vulnerability from the complete absence of a workable legal framework for irregular warfare operations, both at home and overseas. So what should be done? I've been getting the thoughts of retired Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon. Although he's never been a member of UK Special Forces, he has served alongside them.
I'm a specialist rather than special, and my particular area of chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear counter-terrorism. And when the Special Forces are involved in an operation that might involve something like that and they don't have the direct expertise, then that's where people like I come into it to give them that sort of deeper technical support. Certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq, In my memoir, Chemical Warrior, I discuss some of those operations. So, I'm not breaking any confidentialities or rules, but working with them in Iraq when we thought that Al-Qaeda was attacking British troops with anthrax. It was me and my expert teams who, once the source was identified, could then do the monitoring and find out exactly what was going on. But I think it's, the special forces work really at the margins and in the shadows, and very different from conventional operations. And when we were dealing with massive amounts of highly toxic chemicals that the Taliban were using in the drugs trade to turn poppies into heroin, I helped them devise a plan to actually destroy these chemicals. And I suppose my one final rider on that in Afghanistan, one of the things that was of great frustration, I admit the last time I was in Afghanistan was 2011, was actually when we dealt with all these chemicals and some of the Taliban operatives that were involved in it, the fact after 96 hours, these people were let go and, to attack British soldiers again. So that's only my direct experience. But they do call on people like me when they don't have the specialist capabilities themselves.
And that working in the shadows that you mentioned, the special forces by default have to do, isn't that part of the problem? Because no one actually hears when they get it right, but everyone does hear when there are allegations that they got it wrong.
Well, entirely. And certainly that's what I've written about in the Telegraph this week and for Forces News, just to remind people of the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of operations that our special forces have done that have made such a huge impact. They are a force multiplier. They are a strategic effect that really, change the shape of the battlefield, change the shape of operations. Many people know I spent a lot of time in Syria, where I came up against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who were without morals, without any thought for life. And in fact, when I was there in 2013 and 14, it was when many British aid workers were captured by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and beheaded publicly on the internet. And these, I think people need to understand, these are the sort of terrorists that our special forces are dealing with on a daily basis. And that is why their operations need to remain secret. If you let these terrorists know what you're doing and the way that you operate, then you are operating not with one hand tied behind your back, with all of it. And I think it's very important that the public do understand is the many thousands of operations that the Special Forces and the Security Service do, and the many thousands of lives that they saved with the operations that they have done over the last few years and will continue to do in future, hopefully.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there are extreme circumstances sometimes in which they have to work and extreme brutality they have to face. When Brigadier White talks about a complete absence of a workable legal framework for irregular warfare, is he right? Has the law let down both soldiers and the public?
Well, as he points out, and as I think people will realise, this is a very, very difficult area. Our enemy doesn't work in any legal framework and is not constrained at all. And of course, we know that as soldiers, and these are soldiers we're talking about, we must operate to the highest moral code. We have the Armed Forces Act, we have the Geneva Conventions, and we expect everybody, including our special forces, to work within that sort of framework. However, there have been occasions where, when you're operating on the margins, sometimes it is difficult to stay within those rules. Now, going forward, I'm sure the Haddon Cave inquiry will hopefully come up with a mechanism where there can be more scrutiny that satisfies the legal framework and also satisfies the moral requirements that the people in this country expect of our soldiers who are defending them day and night, every day of the year.
Yeah, and as you say, special forces do not have some kind of exemption from the law. How clear is the law at the moment, what they can and cannot do, and who decides that?
The law is very clear, and the interpretation of it, I think, is the challenging area. I expect it's because special forces do operate in the shadows. Most people in this country know the SAS from the BBC programme Rogue Heroes, what they read in various books, and of course what they've seen on the most recent Panorama programme. Now, all of these things give a perception of what special forces are, but actually none of them really get to the heart of the men and women who are doing the most demanding operations in the most difficult conditions. It's very easy to jump to conclusions on watching television programs, but actually we need to come up with a framework that satisfies everybody. And, in all my years working with the SAS and others, and I have many friends who have been SAS operatives for many years and are still SAS operatives. And I don't recognise any of the traits that have been put at the special forces, the negative traits in these people. So I hope that we can develop a framework that satisfies politicians, satisfies the law, and satisfies commentators who are saying things about something that they really probably don't know a great deal about or understand, what the challenges are when operating in this sort of environment.
And Hamish, you've written for our website about concerns the public could lose faith in our special forces. What's needed to address that?
Well, I think it's very reassuring that General Jim Hockenhull, head of Strategic Command, recently has reaffirmed his absolute confidence in our special forces, and he ultimately is their sort of commanding officer. So I think that it would be that should be publicised more. I think a sort of balanced piece, so that the public understand what's going on, and I hope what I've written for Forces News and the Daily Telegraph really gives that sort of perspective that unfortunately, when you're operating in these margins, mistakes happen, and dreadful mistakes where people are being killed when perhaps they shouldn't have been. However, the overused quote by Mark Antony saying, that the good that people do is often forgotten, whereas the evil remains. And I think we just need a balance. The work that our special forces have done for us over the years has been legion, unbelievably. And I think people need to understand that if there have been errors made, then they need to be corrected.
And Hamish, just your point that many people are commenting without understanding the reality of Special Forces operations. It is right, isn't it, though, that if wrong is done, people are held to account?
Absolutely. Nobody is above the law. And if indiscretions, if bad decisions have been made, and if crimes have been committed, then absolutely, that should be followed through. And I think that is why the Haddon Cave inquiry is so important. There must be frustration that it's taking a long time, but it is absolutely right that these things are investigated. And if there is any wrongdoing, then that needs to be corrected. And going forward, we need to find a mechanism where it is more in the open how our special forces are monitored and catered for. But of course, what we cannot do is turn their operations into the open, as it were, because that would denude their capabilities. But fundamentally, like every soldier, they've got to follow the rules of the law.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, great to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
And you can read more of Hamish's thoughts on our website, forcesnews.com. Mike, Hamish says the laws themselves are already clear, but what external scrutiny is there currently that can assess what special forces are doing?
Well, there's nothing unless you set up things like, as Hamish mentioned, the Haddon Cave inquiry, because the line of responsibility is within the command structure. And that is, if you like, stays within the Ministry of Defence, or if there's a problem, then it goes to the Ministry of Defence straight to Downing Street. So the responsibility for reporting is entirely within the military. And that's one of the problems, of course, that there doesn't seem to be enough external scrutiny. But the other thing that I think Hamish mentioned, which is really important, is that people don't really understand very well, and you know why they don't understand it very well, what the Special Forces do. I mean, they are not sent out as groups of assassins. They're not sent out to round people up and arrest or kill them. I mean, other soldiers sometimes do that, and they do sometimes do that. But most special forces spend most of their time doing nothing. of them watching and observing. What makes them special is that they can exist in almost any environment. They can go out in 2s and 3s if necessary and live for weeks on end in the most inhospitable places and simply watch what is happening, observe and report back. And the vast majority of what the Special Forces do is actually reconnaissance and intelligence. And they're special because they can do it and get away with it and get home safely. That's what makes them special.
But just one more thought on the subject of scrutiny. The Lib Dem MP Helen Maguire this week called for a new mechanism to allow parliamentary scrutiny of the work of special forces. We have the Intelligence and Security Committee already scrutinising some of our country's most secret work. So could something like that help?
Well, the ISC it impinges a little bit on special force work when, as I say, most of what special forces do is intelligence collection. And so where the ISC are looking at the intelligence services, then they have a little bit of scrutiny of that. But even so, the special forces are very wary of even what they say to the ISC because of their own security issues. You'd need a special committee, but I don't think a parliamentary committee would do it because, again, to be honest, parliamentary committees are just not secure enough. They do leak because, all parliamentarians are on there and parliamentarians have different agendas. I think you would need a sort of commissioner. And there are commissioners for the intelligence services, for MI5 and MI6. There is a commissioner, which is a person with a staff. And so you could have a commissioner for special forces who is somebody who is trusted and would, on an annual basis, look at the operations of special forces, somebody outside the MOD, but then reporting back, say, direct to the Prime Minister, and that special commissioner, perhaps, could be interrogated by parliamentarians in the Defence Committee or whatever. And that could be a sort of an arm's length relationship where you could get a sort of pseudo-parliamentary scrutiny into it, but it'd be mediated through somebody who the MOD and the Special Forces trust to know what they do and take a fair and very discreet view of the evidence that they're receiving.
Interesting idea. Well, among the people whose actions are under scrutiny at the Haddon Cave inquiry is General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, a former director of Special Forces who has been accused by Panorama of failing to report evidence of alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. He hasn't commented publicly on those claims, but the government appear to have faith in him. He's just been appointed to the Navy's top job, First Sea Lord. Another headline to this appointment, he's not a sailor. He is the first Royal Marine to lead the senior service. Mike, potentially controversial as an appointment for a couple of reasons, but the Defence Secretary calls him a proven leader. What's he going to bring to the job?
Yeah, his credentials are very interesting, actually. He was a Special Forces man, a Royal Marine, and he's come to the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff as a Royal Marine. The only previous one, the person who did that, I think, was Gordon Messenger, who was also a Marine. And I first came across Gwyn Jenkins when he was in and out of Downing Street in about 2011, 2012, something like that. And he's had experience of 4-2 Commando as a Marine in Northern Ireland, and then leading the SBS, the Special Boat Service, in Afghanistan, which is where some of this controversy arises from. But then he's been aide-de-camp to Queen Elizabeth II, so he's been in royal circles. He's been in and out of Downing Street. He's Vice Chief of the Defence Staff. He knows the MOD pretty well. He ticks an awful lot of boxes in terms of real operations, command at the highest level, diplomacy and politics. And he's very straightforward, very nice, very bright character. So I understand the way this controversy attaches to him, and that's got some way to go. And those of us who know a little bit about it know that he's holding on, I think, for a lot of material to come out, which will show that he did the best that he could at the time. That is my belief, but we'll see how that generally goes. But indeed, very unusual for him to become First Sea Lord, and he skipped a rank, He went from Major General to Full General. He was never a 3-star. He went from 2 stars to 4 stars. And that indicates in itself the amount of confidence that both senior politicians and other senior military, I think, have in him.
And of course, this appointment has come slightly sooner than expected because Admiral Sir Ben Key stepped back while he faces a disciplinary investigation. But it's got the rumour mill going about the other top jobs which we know are coming. It's usually mostly a reshuffle. The Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, seems to be a popular tip for the Chief of Defence Staff in the autumn, Mike.
Yes, he might. I mean, everybody's tipping everybody for this sort of thing. But certainly it looks as if he might be a front runner for it. And that would not at all be a bad appointment. And he's an engineer. I mean, usually the chief of air staff turns out to be pilots of one sort or another, either, usually fixed wing, but then rotary wing pilots have also made it. But he's an engineer. And he's very refreshing in his view of air power, I think, whenever on the occasion when I've spoken to him.
And another big name suggested is General Dame Sharon Naismith, currently Vice Chair of the Defence Staff.
Yeah, and I mean, the highest ranking female officer in the armed forces. Again, she hasn't had the benefit of so much combat experience as some of the others, but she's got terrific experience on the organisational side, and she's a doer and a fixer. She fixes things. I remember a VCDS saying to me years ago, they said the job of the VCDS is to take the blame for everything. Well,
Great job.
Dame Sharon has made the job of the VCS to be the fixer, and she does it pretty well.
What about General Sir Rowley Walker, current head of the Army?
Only just taken over the Army, I mean, this year. And that's not unprecedented for somebody to be Army chief for a short period and then move to CDS. Again, Special Forces man. He's an innovator. Again, I struggle to say that any of these are better than the others, but they've all got their strengths and weaknesses. But Rowley Walker is in the middle of a really challenging transformation program. And one thing that might count against him, in a sense, is his potential. His potential to transform the Army might be greater than his potential to sit in the very top job.
Okay. Too good at what he's doing for the moment, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If General Walker gets the job, would General Naismith be a shoo-in for the head of the Army, do you think?
It's a possibility. Army VCDSs don't always, of course, become CGS, but it could be a possibility, and there'd be absolutely nothing wrong with that in terms of Dame Sharon's sheer ability to run things, but she'd be taking over a really transformational job. I'm sure she could do it, but Rowley Walker has made this transformation of the Army his own, as it were, conceptually, which is why I suspect they would rather leave him where he is than put him into the top job. But that's just a guess on my part.
Someone that Hamish mentioned earlier, General Sir Jim Hockenhull, who leads Strategic Command at the moment. What do you think of his chances?
Yeah, less well known than the others because of what Strategic Command does. But, it reminds me a bit about what Enoch Powell used to say about becoming the top job in politics. He said, ability will get you into the room where the decision is made. But when the decision is made, it is down to time and chance and luck. And that's very much the case. All these people are in the room, but the decision when it is made will come down to very specific pros and cons and circumstances. And, whoever emerges from the top job will, to a degree, be lucky as well as very able. But we are now only one person deep in most areas. Because of our armed forces are so small, there are far fewer senior officers around now. You don't have in any of the services a sort of a population of real high flyers all coming through. The danger of small forces, as we got now with very small and very truncated senior levels, is that you end up more or less one person deep in every one of the armed services.
So a final thought then, Mike, whoever ends up sitting at that top table of defence in the next few months, they've all got one heck of a job on their hands, haven't they?
Yeah, and it's not just a heck of a job, Kate, it's also a different job, because what we're about to see is the publication of the National Security Review, the publication of the Strategic Defence Review, a new CDS, and then the NATO summit, which will be a real humdinger on the 24th, 26th of June. And the new CDS, I believe, will be one of a small group of senior people, 3 or 4 of them, who will be charged with really transforming Britain's armed forces. So the new CDS won't just be somebody who has to bridge the sort of politics and the military, which is what they traditionally have to do. It won't just be somebody who has to represent the military, which is what they always have to do. It will also be somebody who's got to get completely involved in drastic change management. So I think the next CDS will be more of a change manager than any CDS in my lifetime.
Mike, thank you. And thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Until then, you can always catch up with past programmes you might have missed online at bfbs.com/sitrep, the BFBS Forces News YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.